Well, I want you to listen now to how each of these city names portray details of the refuge. Now remember, this all starts with the writer of Hebrews takes the word for refuge, for these cities of refuge, and he plops it right down there in Hebrews 6, and he says that Jesus Christ is the refuge we flee to. Now isn't it interesting that there are 6 facets, 6 cities God named? God picked the Hebrew names for each of these cities. There are thousands of cities. He picked these 6. He picked these 6 words, and he picked the 6 meanings that they would encompass. And that's what Paul meant about the types, the things that speak in the Old Testament, reflecting what we see in the New Testament about Jesus Christ. So how do these detail the refuge Christ offers to us to lay hold of every day, every hour, and every moment of our lives? Well, think of it this way. Christ is the closest, the safest, and the only refuge for the unclean. And so if you were going to run off, first of all, to Kadesh, you ran to a holy place or righteous place because you were unclean, because you were guilty, or at least people thought you were guilty in the Old Testament context in these cities, of doing something that was murderous. But for us today, Jesus Christ is the closest, the safest, and the only refuge for the unclean. Why? Because he's the only one that can clean us. The world can give us turning over new leaves and new resolves, and we can get into some program, and we can program ourselves to respond differently. But if there's no divine internal change, we revert back. We're reading as a family the biography of George Mueller. He was a real rascal. He was a lying, cheating, drinking, carousing, just deceitful young man in seminary, no less, going to become a pastor. And he would try his hardest, and he'd make it 1 week, he'd make it 2 weeks, he'd make it 1 day, 2 days with his resolves in the early 1800s. But he never was able to make it because he found, after he was saved, that he had never gotten a new heart. He was never made clean. He was an unclean person putting on exterior trappings of clean or cleanliness. So Christ is the closest, safest, and only refuge for the unclean. Secondly, Christ is the closest, safest, and only refuge for the weary. Thirdly, Christ is the closest and safest and only refuge for the homeless. And by the way, what is a homeless person? It doesn't mean they don't have a house. We have many homeless people in America that have houses. A home is when you're surrounded by people that you trust and love, and you can relax around those you love and trust. Many people live in houses, they don't have a home. And there's a restlessness. We have a lot more homeless in America than the 600,000 they say we have. We have millions of homeless people. They never rest. They never trust. They never are able to relax around those they love. They are truly homeless, and they feel lonely. They feel isolated. They feel detached. And Jesus said, I am the closest, the safest, and the only refuge for you when you feel homeless. He's also the closest and safest and only refuge for the helpless. We come to times in our life when we feel helpless, when there's nothing else we can do. He said, I'm your refuge. He's also the closest and safest and only refuge for us when we feel hopeless. When we come to the place where we don't have hope that anything's going to change, he says, I'm the one that you flee to. And finally, he's the refuge for us when we are tempted. The question is, have you fled to the safest spot in the universe, to Jesus Christ? In other words, have you been saved? And if so, are you experiencing all that he wants to offer in that refuge? Because if you look around, Christ wants to be your moment-by-moment perfect refuge. Turn with me now to the New Testament. I want you to look at 1 Corinthians 10. And this is going to be the beginning of targeting scriptures in the New Testament for you to find Christ as the perfect refuge. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11. This is a wonderful, wonderful reminder from the Apostle Paul. He wrote to the Corinthians, who, by the way, the Corinthians were secular and pagan and mostly Gentile. And he's writing to them, introducing them to what he spent his time studying, the Hebrew Old Testament, the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. And this is what he says after chronicling for 10 verses some of the most amazing stories of the Old Testament. He just whips through them. And if you notice, he talks about in verse 1, Exodus 14, the Exodus event. He talks about in verse 3 the manna in Exodus 16. He talks in verse 4 of chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians about the water from the rock. That's Exodus 17. Then in verse 6 he talks about the lusting after stuff in the wilderness. That's Numbers 11. And then verse 8 he talks about the whole golden calf deal in Exodus 32. Then he talks about the serpent deal in Numbers 25 in verse 9. And then he talks in verse 10 about Numbers 21, the murmuring, and the destroyer that came in Numbers 14 at the other half of the verse. So, he references 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different Old Testament stories in as many verses. Just like he just rattles those stories off like that. And then look what he says in verse 11 after that incredible just archive or just referencing these stories. He says in verse 11, now all these things, these Old Testament accounts, all these Old Testament kind of hard to understand stories, those happened to them, the Jewish people, as examples. And they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the age have come. He said God could have picked out of the millions and billions of different events of the Old Testament world, all the pre-Christ world before his advent. He says he could have picked any of them, but he picked the stories that are contained in those 39 Old Testament books as examples. And the word examples is the Greek word tupos. And that's what we call in Bible study types. And the cities of refuge are just one example of a picture or a type of Jesus Christ. A picture. In fact, if you ever get, and this is something to think about, if you ever are reading through the Old Testament and you're really bored and you can't figure out why on earth that is in there, put Christ right in the middle of it. And you know what? You'll find most often that a lot of those very hard to understand stories, if you see how they reflect on Jesus Christ, all of a sudden you'll understand why God included one of those hard stories. So millions of things could have been recorded, but God chose to record only those things that are in the Old Testament because they enable us to grow in our understanding of Him and how to have a relationship with Him. So, because of that, keep going to the right to Hebrews chapter 6. And I want to show you a type. Hebrews chapter 6, where we've been for the last 3 weeks. Hebrews 6, and look again at the precious words of what verse 18 says. It says that we have fled, verse 18, for a refuge. We have fled for refuge. How do we do that? How do we flee for refuge? Well, Jesus Christ, our hope, our refuge, and our salvation, we saw this morning, it's just one thought away, one prayer away. He's the closest spot of security in the universe. And when we flee to Him, we find that His arms are open. We find that He's waiting for us 24/7. It's not just when you get saved that His door is never locked. It's not just when you come to salvation that you find that He's easy to find and easy to access. It's all the way through life. You know, the scriptures say, as you received Christ, so walk in Him. As you received Him, His arms open to all, His doors never locked, the completely sufficient refuge, the only hope. It's so wonderful. But as you received Him, walk through life, knowing Him in that same way. Jesus is so much better than these earthly cities of refuge because He died for us who are guilty. And not only were we guilty when we got saved, but we are continuing to be guilty of sin. Because all of us sin even after we're saved. And if we say we have no sin, we're liars and we deceive ourselves. No one this side of heaven is perfect or eradicated or sinless. And so Jesus is our perfect refuge because He's the one who died and wants to cleanse the guilty ones. And He is the one who is permanent. He says, once you come to me, I'll never leave you or forsake you, and I'll never push you out, and I'll never say you're just too much and you've sinned one too many times, and I'm through with you, and He'll toss us out. He never does that. He saves us to the uttermost.